So, Brain Smart Principle number 4, brain functions best when the child feels safe. Hopefully you've all got that point by now. This is what fear does to the brain. First of all, just from a psychological perspective, what does fear do to us? It focuses us on what we don't want, right? When you're scared, you're focused on what you don't want, right? So whatever you focus on, you get more of, typically. It also instills a fear that you're not really good enough. If this situation isn't good enough, I'm not good enough, something's wrong, something's not right, etc. And also, it releases cortisol, which impacts learning and memory. Everybody knows what it feels like to be stressed, right? And what happens when you're stressed? We lose our keys. You know, what do I do with my keys? You know, we miss the turn when we're driving, etc. So that is cortisol, which is produced because of the fear, because of our reptilian brain being on red alert, and it affects our learning and memory. So think about a child whose brain is developing. We're trying to send them to school and get them to really develop their learning and memory skills. And yet, if they walk around with cortisol flooding their brains and their bodies, learning isn't really going to take place. So we rely on fear to discipline our children sometimes. We use fear of punishment. Wait till your father gets home. You know, or fear of failure. You don't want to fail that exam. Or fear of loss of love. I'm leaving. You know, fear of loss of I just don't know what I'm going to do anymore. I can't understand why you children won't help me do the dishes. And, you know, we do this kind of stuff to our children all the time. Being a little facetious, but probably because I'm guilty. I was guilty of it too when my children were young. And also fear of abandonment. I'm leaving. I'm going to count to 3. 1, 2, 3. All that stuff that we do, all that use of fear to motivate our children, it puts cortisol in their brains, and the more cortisol we put in their brains, the more we affect their ability to learn and remember. So think about some of the classroom situations. I know Trinidad is much more enlightened than Grenada. I don't believe corporal punishment is allowed in schools. Is that true? It is allowed in schools? It's not allowed, but it's done. But you instill fear in children, and what do? You teach them to be devious, or you teach them to be afraid, or you teach them to be very obedient. But the more obedient a child is, when that child gets to adolescence, who are they going to obey? Their peers, right? Peer pressure. So the more you try to get obedience as the goal instead of cooperation, which comes from connection, the more you're going to have high-risk behaviors. So there's a factory model of education that is prominent in the Western world, and it's basically treating all children as if they're the same, even though they're not. So we have a child widget, and they're supposed to go through their levels of schooling, and they're all supposed to turn out, you know, well-educated, smart, high-achieving students. And yet, what about the children who couldn't do that? They're the non-conforming widgets. They're the ones who get left behind, and they either turn into victims or bullies. That's generally what they do. Victims are the ones who just feel really terrible about themselves. They tend to attract bullies. And then we also have bullies lots of kids who couldn't make it at school, who didn't really do well in school, find other ways to do well. They find other ways to get connected. They find other ways to feel safe. Because that's basically the drive of the brain, is to feel safe and connected. And if that's what you use your problem-solving ability for, then your brain is probably not for it. So there's a Q-tip method for adults. This is called the conscious method of education as opposed to the factory model of education. So does anybody know what Q-tip stands for? So we see a child misbehaving. What do we tend to do? We tend to take it personally. Q-tip means quit taking it personally. Okay? So if you quit taking it personally, then that helps you to be in your frontal lobe so that you can teach a child new skills. Conflict is an opportunity to teach skills. So we really need situations that have no tolerance for violence, but full tolerance for conflict, because conflict is inevitable. Children are going to grow up with conflict. There's conflict all around us. Look at the world, it's full of conflict. We can use conflict as a way to teach skills. First, how to be safe. Second, how to be connected. And third, how to solve problems. So, as I said before, misbehavior is a call for help. It's a sign of a skill deficit. And it's an attempt to meet one's unmet needs for safety, connection, and problem solving. If we could rephrase child behavior in terms of this, we would be developing every child's brain. If we had the skills to be able to do that. So fear shuts the brain down, shuts the frontal lobes down. And one of my mentors, Becky Bailey, likes to use the word brilliance. That's what comes out of your frontal lobe. When you're in your frontal lobes, you can be brilliant, you can be creative, you can make things up. And we can't do that when we're in our brainstem or when we're feeling disconnected. So fear focuses you on what you don't want. Prolonged fear kills brain cells. Disciplining obedience trains children to surrender rather than get into their frontal lobes and solve problems. In schools and families with zero tolerance for violence and full tolerance for conflict, it's an opportunity to teach should really be our goal worldwide, regardless of culture. And I know I talk to people in Grenada a lot about this stuff, and I'm not Grenadian. I can't talk about Grenadian culture. I certainly have no right to talk about Trinidad or Trinidadian culture, but I do know the developing brain. And developing brains are all the same. They have these basic needs for survival and safety and connection. And if we provide that, then we also are providing opportunities for children to learn problem-solving skills. So I think it's important for everybody to know about this thing called the victim triangle. I spoke a little bit about victims and bullies and rescuers. So there will always be victims, right? There will always be people who have had difficult things happen to them. We could call them survivors instead of victims if we wanted to. They could call themselves survivors instead of victims. Think about a victim. What does a victim need? First of all, a victim needs somebody to hurt him, right? Somebody or something to hurt him. So that means an abuser. And a victim needs a rescuer or else he would die. So victims are always calling for rescuers and abusers, people who are also having unmet needs for safety and unmet needs for connection. Most victims, if they survive, decide, I'm not going to be a victim anymore. So they turn around and they turn into rescuers. I'm going to make sure this never happens to anybody else. Or they become abusers themselves. All abusers are former victims. And all rescuers are people who don't want to be victims, and they're going to try to help victims so they don't have to take responsibility for themselves. The problem with being a rescuer is you get burned out. And pretty soon you get mad at all victims and mad at all the abusers, and you turn into an abuser yourself. The problem with being an abuser is sometimes people have an epiphany and they decide, I don't want to be an abuser anymore, and they start to feel like victims. Or maybe they turn into rescuers. But this is called the victim triangle because at any given moment you could be all three with three different people. So you could walk around feeling like a victim was one person, feel really upset, turn around and abuse somebody else, probably your kid, and then feel really horribly guilty and buy the child something that you don't need to buy, and spoil the child would be too permissive. Permissiveness always comes from this kind of victim triangle, always. So I try to include this in all my talks because if we could get off this victim triangle, make sure everybody takes responsibility for themselves, including children. So when children make mistakes, they have consequences. We want them to learn from their consequences. But we don't want to turn them into victims. We certainly don't want to turn them into bullies. And being a rescuer isn't a very helpful thing to do. There may be a lot of people go into mental health, a lot of people go into medicine because they want to be rescuers. But the sad thing about that is they get burned out and then they turn into victims or bullies themselves. So this victim triangle is really important stuff to understand in terms of brain development, yes, but also in terms of just regular living in the world. So we have an alternative triangle. It's called safety, care and connection, and responsibility. That's what I try to go around talking about. So in order to do that, we have to have something called emotional intelligence. I'll talk very briefly about emotional intelligence. I want to make sure we have lots of time to have some conversations. But as you saw from the pictures of babies and from the videos with babies, we have these hardwired emotions: interest, fear, disgust, anger, sadness, and joy. All people, all cultures have these hardwired emotions. This is another way of looking at them: happy, sad, scared, mad, surprised, disgusted, and guilty or ashamed. Here's some pictures of them. It turns out there are cranial nerves, which are in the basement of our brains. They run through the reptilian brain. They are what determine our expression of these feelings. And your face is going to respond to an experience faster than your conscious mind will. So if something scary happens, before you register what it is, your face is going to show that fear face. Those cranial nerves are really, really fast.